6,000 crosses, 6,000 bodies, hanging along a road nearly 200 kilometers long. Every step along this road smelled of death, burnt wood, and human pain. According to Appian, the bodies hung from Capua all the way to the gates of Rome, a punishment intended to chill any heart where the thought of rebellion still flickered. But could Rome truly conquer through fear, or did it become its own prisoner? In those years, around 71 BC, Rome had barely recovered from the nightmare of Spartacus's rebellion, a gladiator who dared to challenge the empire itself. The rebellion lasted 2 years, and under its banners fought tens of thousands of slaves, fugitives, and former soldiers. When it all ended, Rome wanted more than just victory. It wanted revenge, a lesson burned into the consciousness of every individual. This form of intimidation was called crucifixion. Death on the cross was not so much an execution as a public spectacle of pain. It was not a swift sword blow, but a slow dying in the sun, where the body itself became a warning. The Romans used it for slaves and traitors, those who could not be killed with honor. Can one imagine, day after day on both sides of the road, crosses stood, hundreds, then thousands. Plutarch wrote that the crucified remained hanging until their bodies began to decompose from time and birds. Rome transformed the Appian Way, a symbol of trade and strength, into a road of fear. The tactic of intimidation used by the Romans had its own name, Metus Romanus, Roman fear. It was an instrument of power, not just to defeat an enemy, but to make the very thought of resistance impossible. Just as today armies demonstrate power through satellite imagery and drones, then Rome demonstrated it through crosses and bodies. But what compelled people, accustomed to iron discipline, to such measures? The answer lies deeper, in the very fear that Rome could one day fall not from an external enemy, but from its own slaves. For Spartacus was not a king, a commander, or a chieftain. He was a man of the arena, of dust, blood, and sand. The system of slavery, upon which all of Rome stood, began to crack. By various estimates, the number of slaves in Italy at that time exceeded 2 million, almost a third of the population. When the rebellion erupted, it became clear, if they united, the legions could prove powerless. Therefore, the crucifixions along the road were not only a punishment, but also an insurance prop for the entire system. This road, the Appian Way, built centuries before the rebellion, became the boundary between the world of freedom and the world of subjugation. Every passerby was meant to see, this is what happens to those who dare to raise a hand against Rome. But even in this gloom, a shadow of doubt remained. For fear is a weapon that in time turns against its owner. When soldiers built cross after cross, did none of them wonder, what if one day we find ourselves on these roads? From this question begins the history of Rome's most brutal psychological attack, an attack where the main enemy became not Spartacus's army, but human consciousness. When the war ended, the field near Petelia was strewn with bodies. Plutarch wrote that Spartacus fell, fighting his way towards Crassus himself, battling until his last breath. His body was never found, and in this disappearance, a legend was born, which Rome tried to erase with blood. But what happened after the battle was no longer war. It was a mass spectacle for history itself. By Crassus's order, 6,000 captured rebels were crucified along the entire Appian Way. Troops split into detachments. Some dug pits, others built crosses. One cross, several poles, ropes, nails, and time. According to historians' calculations, the erection of such a number of executions took several weeks. This was not haste, but a method. Caesar would later call such actions intimidation through order, demonstratio disciplinae. For the Romans, such a procedure was not simply an act of punishment. It adhered to military logic. The psychological effect was meant to be maximal. Each cross, a message. Every slave, every merchant, every soldier passing along the road was meant to see and remember that against Rome there was no salvation. Crucifixion, as a form of execution, had a special meaning. Death could last from 1 to 3 days. A person nailed to the wood gradually suffocated, as their muscles could not support their own weight. Sometimes, to hasten the end, their legs were broken. But Crassus did not rush. He wanted the executed to guard the road with their suffering. The Romans called this exemplum, an example, a model of punishment that was meant to be remembered for centuries. This word would later become the root for exemplary behavior. But then exemplum meant one thing: fear. Those who passed by heard the groans of the living and saw the bodies of the dead. Historians wrote that the smell was unbearable. The wind from the sea carried the decay to the nearest villas. Even hardened legionaries averted their eyes. And yet Crassus ordered that no one be taken down until complete decomposition. Seemingly, victory was achieved. But in the shadow of this horror, another threat was brewing. For such a display of force revealed weakness, the fear of repetition. For an empire built on the idea of order, a slave rebellion was like a crack in the foundation. It was then that an idea emerged, which would later become part of the strategy for suppressing rebellions. Intimidation not through the sword, but through image. The Romans called this approach terror visibilis, visible terror. Its power lay in its permanence. Fear had to live longer than suffering. The Appian Way became the first axis of mass intimidation in history. Today, this can be compared to how modern states display power through military parades, columns of tanks, or satellite images of destroyed cities. Then, all this was replaced by crosses, wooden, decaying, but eternal in memory. According to archaeological data, remnants of wooden piles found along the ancient course of the Appian Way indeed correspond to the descriptions of ancient authors. Researchers believe that some of the crosses stood for years until the wood itself decayed. Crassus understood. Victory had to be visible. He ordered that the bodies not be removed until they disintegrated under the rains and sun. This became not just a punishment, it was an assertion of power, written in flesh. Warriors passing by were meant to see this sign of order. A city living in fear became manageable. From this moment, Rome began to employ such actions as part of its military doctrine. In the East, in Judea, roads of fear also appeared in subsequent decades. Tacitus wrote of thousands crucified after rebellions in Syracuse and Jerusalem, but none of them could compare to the Appian Way. 6,000 crosses stretching to the horizon were not just a punishment, it was an architecture of fear, a psychological attack where suffering became the weapon and human memory itself was the target. And yet, in this theater of death, there is a paradox. The more Rome tried to erase the memory of the rebellion, the deeper it became etched into history. Each cross became a reminder of the man who once dared to challenge the empire. Thus, a new era was born, an era when power understood. Controlling the body is easy, but controlling memory is far more difficult. And memory, like the road, stretched further to the very gates of Rome. When the last cries ceased, silence began, a silence heavier than any sound. Crassus's legions lined up along the road, watching the sun rise above thousands of crosses. This was not the end of the rebellion, but the beginning of a demonstration of power. At that moment, Rome finally understood that people could be governed not only by the sword, but also by fear, which had become as tangible as the iron of their armor. At dawn, a procession began along the Appian Way. Leading the way were legates, military representatives of the commander. Each of them was responsible for their section of the road. It was they who ensured that the crosses stood straight, like soldiers on parade. A symbol of power demanded precision. Even death in Rome had to be disciplined. In the Roman army, an officer called the camp prefect, praefectus castrorum, was responsible for order. He was responsible not only for the camps, but also for organizing the space of war. The Appian Way in those days turned into a giant death camp, and Crassus into the architect of a psychological catastrophe. Roman sources note that for several weeks no one dared to travel this road at night. Merchants waited for dawn to pass the crosses, while caravans of soldiers marched silently, hearing only the flapping of flags in the wind and the cries of ravens. This was a soundscape of fear, a sound in which power resonated louder than steel. Livy wrote that from this moment on, Roman commanders began to consider intimidation as an element of strategy. Fear became a resource, like bread, weapons, or gold. It nourished discipline, it suppressed doubt, it built order. Archaeological findings confirm the scale of this action. In the area of the old stations of the Appian Way, fragments of iron rings and rivets have been discovered, which could have been used to attach bodies to the crosses. In the soil, traces of charcoal, evidence of bonfires where remains were likely burned. These findings only reinforce what ancient chroniclers wrote about. This was not an improvisation. It was a ritual. Romans believed in the power of signs. Every road, every arch, every inscription was meant to speak of might. This was the principle of auctoritas, authority that needs no words. The Appian Way became a symbol of such authority. There was no talk of justice here. Here was only a demonstration of the fact that power is immortal and man is not. Crassus did not hide that he wanted to surpass his rivals in the Senate. After all the defeats that the Romans suffered from Spartacus, he needed to restore not only order, but also respect. Therefore, he chose the most spectacular punishment. Cicero would later say, Crassus conquered not by the sword, but by the sight of crucifixions. And in these words lay the essence of his victory. Warriors returning from the south recounted that the crosses stretched to the very horizon. Some bodies had already blackened from the sun, others were still moving. Even months later, the road remained impassable due to the stench and flies. And all this time, the Romans dared not remove them. Death was meant to work. But in this picture of horror, there was one element that neither Crassus nor the Senate could control. This was time. With each passing day, the crosses lost their shape, the planks rotted, the ropes broke. Death ceased to be an intimidation and became commonplace. Where there was once horror, apathy emerged. People began to pass by, not raising their eyes. Thus Rome encountered a new phenomenon, the habituation to violence. Historians call this assuetudo crudelitatis, the habit of cruelty. When violence becomes part of the landscape, it ceases to terrify. Crassus, who desired eternal fear, created indifference, and yet the effect was achieved. For almost a century after Spartacus's rebellion, no large-scale slave uprising erupted in Italy again. People remembered not Spartacus, they remembered the crosses. But as soon as the memory of fear fades, the memory of the man returns. Already in the first decades after the events, stories emerged that Spartacus had not died, but had gone east, that his cross was empty, that he had become a shadow haunting Rome. These legends became a kind of mirror. The more power tried to erase the name of the rebel, the brighter it burned. And so, over decades, the Roman Appian Way, built for trade and victories, transformed into a road of memory, a trace that even rain could not wash away. But what was happening in Rome itself when the smell of death reached its streets? What did the people feel, seeing how the empire celebrated victory over its slaves? When news of the executions reached Rome, the city plunged into a strange silence. There were no triumphal processions, no laurel wreaths. The Senate did not dare to honor Crassus. Too much blood, too much pain. Romans were accustomed to wars, but this was different. This was a reflection of internal fear, and everyone understood. In the place of these slaves could be anyone who would stand against authority. In the forum, they discussed not the victory, but the price it cost. Some senators whispered that Crassus had gone too far, that the Appian Way had turned into a cursed place. According to Appian, even years later, travelers tried to avoid it at night. The living avoided looking at the traces of death remaining in the earth and memory. Crassus, meanwhile, consolidated his influence. He became the wealthiest man in Rome, a man capable of buying an entire army. But a shadow followed the wealth. His contemporaries wrote that he gained power but lost peace. And perhaps it was this guilt for the 6,000 crosses that compelled him to seek atonement in a new war, in a campaign against the Parthians, where he, ironically, perished in the sands, and his army was annihilated. For Rome, this story became a turning point. After the executions along the Appian Way, the empire began to build a system designed to preclude the very possibility of rebellions. Slaves were now distributed among estates so they could not unite. Special overseers appeared, dispensatores, who managed slaves and reported the slightest suspicions. Thus, fear became not only an instrument of power, but also its structure. But in popular memory, Spartacus did not vanish. Decades passed, and his name began to be uttered not as a curse, but as a symbol. In ancient graffiti found by archaeologists in Pompeii, one finds the words Spartacus free. This was a quiet challenge, thrown across generations. At the same time, in Rome, the very perception of fear changed. If earlier it was external, spectacular, now it became internal. Legionaries who participated in the executions spoke of nightmares, of screams they continued to hear in their sleep. Tacitus mentioned that even years later, veterans of Spartacus's rebellion avoided speaking about it. For them, it was not glory, but a memory that burned. Psychologists of our time would call this post-traumatic stress disorder, but in those years it was simply silence. Warriors returned home, carrying within them not only victory, but also the fear they themselves had created. Thus, Rome first encountered the fact that psychological weapons work both ways. Archaeologists found unusual inscriptions in the catacombs near the old Appian Way. Short phrases like, "They were human," and "All roads lead to death." Perhaps these were the words of those who could not forget what they had seen. Perhaps these are the first traces of internal doubt in Rome's infallibility. Since then, Roman military doctrine underwent changes. Public executions became rare, and punishments moved behind barracks walls. The Senate understood. Too overt cruelty weakens rather than strengthens power. But the memory of that road lived on. It became a kind of symbol of a limit to what a state can descend when fear replaces reason. There is a theory that it was precisely under the impression of the events of Spartacus's rebellion that Caesar would later create his own system of control, not through intimidation, but through discipline and loyalty. He understood. It is easier to govern with respect than with terror, but Crassus's lesson would remain in Rome's memory forever. Contemporaries wrote that, driving along the cleared Appian Way, one could discern dark stains in the earth, as if the soil itself had absorbed the blood. Even decades later, locals avoided planting trees along the roadsides. They said that, "The earth there does not want to grow." This image, though poetic, seems all too accurate. Nothing is born from fear. However, from this very horror, a myth grew. When the empire fell, centuries later, Spartacus became a symbol of resistance to oppression. His name returned again and again in poems, plays, legends, and Crassus remained merely as the man who built the most terrifying road in history. But behind this road lies a question that has not disappeared even today. Where does power end and cruelty begin? And can a state, having once chosen the path of fear, ever turn away from it? Rome was accustomed to believing its strength lay in swords, but after Spartacus's rebellion, it became clear. The empire's power rested on fear, not on gold, not on laws, but on the ability to make fear a constant companion of every citizen. And the Appian Way became the laboratory where this fear was first tested as a weapon of mass action. Years later, Roman philosophers began to debate, was it possible to govern without resorting to terror? Seneca wrote that fear is the glue that holds power, but the same glue that binds slaves. And indeed, an empire built on intimidation found itself trapped. The more it instilled fear, the more it feared itself. New rituals began to appear in the legion barracks. Soldiers swore oaths not only of loyalty to their commander, but also of unconditional obedience, even in the face of cruel orders. This system was called sacramentum militare, a military oath, a sacred vow, for the breach of which death followed. Warriors were meant not to think, but to obey. Thus, the fear born on the Appian Way transformed into a discipline without which Rome could no longer exist. Interestingly, even Rome's architecture changed after these events. Monumental triumphal arches appeared, symbols of victories where enemies were depicted not as people but as faceless shadows. This was a different kind of intimidation, no longer with bodies but with images. Power understood. One could control consciousness not only through blood, but also through symbolism. Historians note that it was precisely after Spartacus's rebellion that Rome began to meticulously document its military campaigns. Every campaign, every execution, every order, everything was recorded, not for memory, but for control. For what is recorded is subjugated. This was a new form of power, bureaucratic. And in this sense, the 6,000 crosses were the first act of documenting fear, a visual archive etched into human destinies. Archaeological data confirms that along the old Appian Way, in sections near Fondi and Aricia, nails, crossbeams, and traces of posts were found, precisely where ancient texts indicated the place of executions. Scholars assert that some of the crosses stood for so long that paths formed around them, which people used to bypass the place of death. For centuries, people tried not to cross the boundaries of those shadows. Meanwhile, the very image of Spartacus gradually transformed into a symbol of what Rome tried to destroy: human dignity. Already in the 1st century A.D., he was written about with a shade of respect, as a man who dared to fight not for power, but for freedom. Paradoxically, it was Rome itself wishing to erase his memory that immortalized his name. Plutarch said, "Crassus won, but Spartacus remained in words." These words proved prophetic. Centuries later, Spartacus became what Rome could never fully become, a symbol not of empire, but of spirit. His story was passed down in schools, turned into myth, but a myth based on facts becomes stronger than history itself. For many historians, the crucifixion of 6,000 people was the first historical example of what we today call psychological warfare, a term that only appeared in the 20th century. It essentially describes what Crassus did. He understood, one can kill the body, but one can only conquer the mind. Tacitus noted that after this event, Roman commanders began to pay more attention not only to battles, but also to how enemies perceived defeat. The empire learned to create not just victories, but impressions. Every campaign was accompanied by processions, every victory by architecture, every death by a symbol. All this grew from one road strewn with crosses. But still, if one listens to the breath of history, a contradiction can be caught. Those who created fear were also its victims. Crassus died in terror. His army was surrounded and destroyed. The Parthians filled his head and hands with molten gold, a symbol of his greed and vanity. It seemed fate itself returned to Rome the pain it had sown on its land. And so, when it was all over, Rome was left with a memory that could not be erased. 6,000 crosses became not just a punishment, they became a mirror. In it, the empire saw itself, cruel, brilliant, mortal. But as long as this memory lived, Rome still seemed eternal. The question is only what happens when the mirror breaks, when fear, having become a weapon, ceases to work, when a road, once full of bodies, becomes just a road. And when the empire, confident in its immortality, first feels that its strength is merely a shadow cast by the sun onto the old, rotting wood of a cross. Centuries passed, the Appian Way once again filled with the noise of chariots, merchants, and travelers. The crosses had long disappeared, the earth covered the traces, but the memory remained. Every stone of this road remembered the sound of hammers and the moans of the doomed. Historians said that it was here that Rome first saw itself without a mask, not as a civilization, but as an empire of fear. Today, archaeologists call this section the Road of the Dead, although it is officially known as Via Appia Antica. And yet, even after 2,000 years, standing on these ancient slabs, one can feel that same weight, as if the earth still breathes fear. But if one listens more closely, beneath this fear something else resonates: human stubbornness. For Spartacus, a man without rank, without an army, without a chance, made the greatest power in the world tremble. And although his cross disappeared, the idea of freedom remained. Rome won, but this victory turned into a curse. Fear, once a weapon, also became its weakness. An empire built on crosses could not hold on to its own soul. And now, when we speak of 6,000 crosses along the road, we speak not only of the past, we speak of how easily man turns fear into order, and order into violence. Thus arises a question, not historical, but personal. If you were walking along this road, past thousands of crucified, would you be able not to lower your eyes? Or perhaps in each of us lives that very fear which once made Rome eternal and mortal at the same time.